The widow's lantern burned low that evening, its flicker barely strong enough to keep the shadows at bay. Outside, the wind dragged over the empty street of Dry Creek, carrying the rattle of loose shutters and the smell of dust that had not seen rain in months. The village, once lively with the bustle of cattle drives and freight wagons, had fallen into a quiet that felt older than the boards holding up its saloons. Folks spoke in hushed tones about how the frontier had shifted, leaving towns like theirs to fade into memory. Yet for some, Dry Creek was still alive, still holding secrets, bargains, and longings too dangerous to name aloud. The widow sat by her porch, hands folded in her lap, staring at the horizon where the sky bled purple into black. She carried herself with the stillness of someone who had seen too much loss, yet too much pride to bow beneath it. People whispered about her whenever she walked through the mercantile or attended Sunday service. Some said she was cursed. Others said she had a way of holding men's eyes that made them forget their sense. Whatever the truth, she wore her loneliness like a second skin, and it seemed the whole town leaned toward it, though none dared touch. It was on a night like this, with the crickets silent and the coyotes restless in the hills, that he appeared again, the cowboy who had been drifting in and out of town for as long as she could remember. He was the kind of man the land itself seemed to shape, broad shoulders hardened by trail work, boots worn near through, a voice made rough by wind and whiskey. He didn't belong to Dry Creek, and yet the sight of him riding through its empty streets always felt inevitable. Like thunder rolling before a storm, children hid behind doors when he passed, and old men tipped their hats with a wariness that wasn't quite respect. No one knew where he laid his head at night or what business brought him back after months away. Some swore he carried gold from the mountains, others that he was running from a blood debt. What was certain was the way his eyes lingered too long when they met the widow's. And what was certain, too, was the silence that fell across town whenever the two of them crossed paths. That evening, he tied his horse outside the livery and walked the long road toward her porch. Boots striking dust, spurs chiming faint under the hush, he moved with the patience of a man who had waited too long already. Folks watching from windows drew their curtains, as though afraid the night itself might witness what was about to unfold. She saw him coming, but did not rise. Her gaze held steady, though inside her chest her heart thumped like a hammer. He stopped at the bottom step, and for a moment, nothing stirred, just the two of them, the lamplight and the dry rasp of the wind. He lowered his hat, shadows carving sharp lines across his face, and when he spoke, it was more whisper than sound, carried by the space between them. "I'd trade 10 herds for one night inside you," he said, the words slipping out like a confession meant only for the dark. The widow did not flinch, though her knuckles tightened against her skirt. She knew better than to take such talk for jest. A man who had nothing would not offer cattle he did not own unless he meant to stake something deeper. And this drifter with eyes full of roads untaken, was not a man who spoke without weight. Her mind flashed to the last time they'd stood close at the edge of town when the marshal was burying his kin. The cowboy had been there too, head bowed, silent as stone. Their eyes had met across the grave, and she had seen in him the same hollowness that carved through her own soul. Perhaps that was why his words now made the air tremble, but the widow was not one to yield easy. She leaned back, the wooden chair groaning under her, and let the paws hang like a rope between them. Finally, she said, her voice calm but edged, "Cattle don't buy what you're asking." The cowboy's mouth curved in a half-smile, though his eyes stayed grave. "Maybe not. But I reckon some things out here can't be bought, only taken if offered." For the first time in years, the widow felt a shiver that wasn't born from grief. His nearness stirred something she had buried deep, something dangerous. She glanced toward the road, half expecting to see the marshal's men watching or the preacher stepping out with his Bible in hand. But the street was empty, the town pretending to sleep. She should have sent him away then. She should have told him that his kind of talk had no place in a village already clinging by its nails to respectability. Yet her lips would not form the words. Instead, silence stretched again, heavy, unbroken, until the sound of hooves thundered from beyond the ridge. Both their heads snapped toward the hills. Lanterns flickered in nearby windows, and a dog barked down the street. The cowboy straightened, his hand brushing the revolver at his side as though by habit. The widow's heart climbed to her throat. Whoever was riding hard at this hour was bringing more than dust. Trouble had a way of arriving after sundown in Dry Creek, and tonight it was coming straight for them. The cowboy looked back at her, eyes steady as the hoofbeats drew closer, louder, echoing like drums of war. And before she could speak, before she could even rise from her chair, the night cracked wide open with the cry of a rider tearing through the street, shouting words that would change everything. The widow's lamp flickered, and in its last trembling glow, she knew that nothing in Dry Creek would ever be the same again. The horse came charging down the main street, kicking up clouds of dust so thick they blurred the glow of the lanterns. The rider bent low in the saddle, his hat barely clinging to his head as the hooves struck against the hardened ground. His voice carried through the night, ragged and urgent, though his words tangled with the wind. The widow leaned forward, straining to hear, but all that reached her was the echo of desperation. The cowboy at her steps had already stepped out into the road, boots planted, his hand resting firm against the iron at his hip. His stillness, paired with the thunder of hooves, set the air trembling. When the rider came into the light, the widow saw his face pale and streaked with sweat. His horse was lathered and foaming, its ribs showing the strain of the run. The man tried to slow the beast, pulling hard on the reins, but the animal staggered before crashing against a hitching post. The rider nearly tumbled out of the saddle, stumbling onto the ground with a choked cry. He clutched his side, his shirt stained dark with something the widow didn't need to guess at. The cowboy was on him in an instant, catching him before he hit the dirt. The widow rose from her chair at last, her body moving without thought, skirts brushing against the porch boards as she stepped forward. Her heart hammered as she saw the rider's face in full. He was young, barely more than a boy, his eyes wide with fear, lips cracked from thirst. "They're comin'," the boy gasped, his voice hoarse. "Outlaws. 24 at least, ridden straight this way." The words landed heavy in the night. Dry Creek had known bandits before, but never in numbers so bold, never with such certainty. The widow felt her stomach turn cold as the meaning struck her. The quiet of the village had only been the stillness before a storm. The cowboy eased the boy to the ground, his jaw tightening. "Where?" he asked. "From the south trail," the boy whispered, fighting for breath. They burned the Miller place. Didn't leave no one standing." His eyes flicked toward the widow, pleading, as though the truth he carried was too much for his tongue to shape. Then his body sagged, breath rattling, and he went still. The widow pressed a hand to her lips. She had known the Miller's simple folk, a man and his wife with 2 little ones, their home sitting lonely at the edge of the prairie. To think of them swallowed by fire and fury was more than her mind could hold. The cowboy straightened slowly, his shadow long in the lamplight. His face revealed nothing, but the widow could see the storm behind his eyes. He looked down the road toward the dark hills where the hoofbeats had thundered from. Then, as though remembering she was there, he turned to her. "You best get inside," he said, voice low but steady. The widow shook her head. If what he said is true, there ain't a door in this town thick enough to keep them out. The cowboy studied her a moment longer, then nodded once, grimly. "Then we'll need more than doors." Lanterns flickered to life across Dry Creek as townsfolk stepped cautiously from their homes, drawn by the noise. Murmurs rippled through the street as they gathered, fear plain on every face. The preacher. clutched his Bible as though it might shield him, while the blacksmith's fists clenched and unclenched, his jaw working with the need to act. The marshal, gray-haired and tired from years that had taken more from him than they'd given, pushed through the crowd, his badge dull in the moonlight. "What's this talk of outlaws?" he demanded, his voice breaking the hush. The cowboy stood tall, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. "It ain't talk," he said. "They're ridden this way, and they'll be here before long." A ripple of panic stirred through the crowd, whispers sharp as blades. The widow saw it in their eyes, the dread of knowing their quiet town, their fragile safety, was about to shatter. Some spoke of running, but the cowboy's voice cut through. "Run, and they'll hunt you down on the trail. Stay, and maybe you've got a chance." The marshal's eyes narrowed. "And what would you know about it? Drifter? You've never stood for this town." The cowboy met his gaze, unflinching. "I've stood where men had no choice but to fight, and I've seen what happens to folks who think hiding will save them. You want to live through this night, you'll need to choose now." The widow watched the two men, the weight of their words pressing on everyone present. She had lived long enough to know fear could break a town faster than bullets. And she could see, too, that the cowboy's presence unsettled the marshal not just because he was an outsider, but because he carried with him a certainty that the lawman had lost years ago. The preacher stepped forward, his voice trembling. "The Lord will provide if we hold fast to our faith." But the blacksmith spat into the dirt. "Faith won't stop bullets. I say we listen to the drifter." The crowd shifted, torn between fear and pride, between hope and the grim pull of survival. The widow said nothing, but her eyes never left the cowboy. He stood there like a man carved from the land itself, waiting, unbending. At last, the marshal spoke again, though his voice lacked its former strength. "If it's a fight they want, we'll give 'em one. But hear me, every one of you, this town ain't got soldiers. We've got farmers, shopkeepers, families. You'd best think twice before you raise iron against men who've already shown they've got no mercy." The silence that followed felt endless. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, its cry sharp against the night. The widow's breath caught as she realized the truth. None of them would speak aloud. This wasn't just another raid. This was something larger, something darker. The boy's warning, the fire at the Miller place, these outlaws weren't drifting thieves. They were bringing war. Her eyes drifted back to the cowboy, and she found him watching her, as though her thoughts were laid bare. For a heartbeat, the space between them tightened, and she felt the weight of what he had whispered on her porch. She knew then that whatever happened next, his path and hers had already been bound together by something deeper than chance. But before the widow could look away, before the marshal could rally his people, another sound cut through the night, the distant crack of gunfire, faint but unmistakable. Every head turned toward the hills, and the air seemed to thin as realization swept through the crowd. The outlaws weren't just coming. They were already close enough to taste the town's fear. The widow felt her stomach knot. She wanted to cry out, to tell them to run, to hide, to do anything that would spare their children the horrors she knew were on the horizon. But the words caught in her throat. The cowboy adjusted his hat, his voice even as he spoke. "They'll be here before dawn. You've got hours at best. Decide how you want to greet 'em." The townsfolk scattered then, some rushing for rifles, others for their families. The marshal barked orders with what little authority he could muster. The preacher murmured prayers, and the blacksmith stoked his forge as though heat and iron might yet save them. The widow stood rooted in place, her lantern sputtering in the wind. She could feel the night pressing in, heavy with dread and waiting. The boy's lifeless body still lay on the ground, his warning echoing in her ears. And beside her, the cowboy lingered, silent and watchful, like a man who already knew how. The night would end. The hoofbeats in the distance grew louder, more certain now, like the drum of fate rolling closer with every passing moment. And as the widow looked toward the dark horizon, she realized that Dry Creek's quiet life had ended. The moment the rider fell at her porch, what was coming would leave nothing untouched. But she also knew, though she dared not admit it, that the cowboy's whisper still burned hotter in her chest than the fear that now held the town in its grip. The night stretched on, heavy with waiting, and the outlaws drew nearer. The night wore heavy on Dry Creek, thicker than the dust that clung to every plank and window. Lanterns swung from porches as townsfolk hurried about, voices sharp with fear though they tried to keep steady. The gunfire in the distance had faded, but the echoes of it lingered in everyone's chest. No one doubted the truth anymore. Outlaws were close, and they were coming with fire and blood. The widow found herself moving through the streets with her shawl drawn tight, not knowing whether she meant to help or simply to keep from trembling. Children clung to their mothers, and fathers dragged crates of ammunition from hiding places they had sworn never to use. The blacksmith hammered iron into shapes that could be bolted to doors or used as barricades, his sweat running black with soot. The preacher prayed loud enough for all to hear, but his eyes darted toward the hills as though heaven might not be listening. The marshal tried to gather the men in front of the saloon, barking orders, his badge catching what little light the moon offered. But his voice cracked each time he raised it, and the people heard the falter in his tone. The widow knew what that meant. The town was looking for someone else to follow, whether they admitted it or not. And every time the cowboy spoke, calm and sure, heads turned his way. He walked among them as though he had done this before, pointing where to place barrels, telling men to sight their rifles, showing women how to steady trembling hands if it came to loading bullets. He never raised his voice, but people listened. The widow watched him closely, wondering what life he had lived to make war feel as natural as breathing. He carried the weight of the night like a man born to it. When he passed her, he slowed. "You ought to be inside," he said, not unkindly. She met his gaze. "If they burn this town like they burned the Millers, there won't be no inside." For a moment, she thought he might argue, but instead he nodded as if he respected the truth in her words. "Then stay close. Don't stray." She didn't answer. She couldn't, not with her throat thick with feelings she had no business stirring at a time like this. Still, she stayed where his shadow wasn't far from hers. By midnight, Dry Creek had the look of a camp before battle. Windows were shuttered, rifles leaned by doorways, and a nervous silence stretched through the streets. The widow found herself drawn to the sound of voices behind the saloon, where the older men argued in low tones. The marshal was there, standing, stiff against the barrel of whiskey he leaned on. "We ain't soldiers," one man said. "Half of us couldn't hit a tin can at 10 paces. You put us against riders that know their trade, and we'll be slaughtered." Another spat into the dirt. "And what choice we got? They already cut down the Millers. You think they'll show mercy here?" The marshal shook his head, his eyes tired. "I've been in this job 20 years. Never seen a raid like this. Not this many. This ain't about money or cattle. They're here to make a point." "What point?" someone asked. The marshal's silence said enough. Fear was the point. Dominion. If Dry Creek fell, every town along the trail would know that no law, no marshal, no preacher could stand against the outlaws. From the corner, the cowboy spoke. His voice carried without force, but its silence the phalanxed. "Men all the same. They're led by a man named Kane. I've crossed his path before." Heads turned. The widow leaned forward, her pulse quickening at the name. The cowboy's eyes were hard, his jaw set. "Kane don't come for coin alone. He comes for control. He don't just take, he breaks. Leaves nothing but ashes behind." He paused, his gaze sweeping the men. "If he's riding here, It ain't by accident. Someone wanted Dry Creek broken. A murmur rippled through the group. The widow felt a chill crawl up her spine. It was one thing to fear nameless outlaws, but to hear one named a leader with purpose made the night heavier still. Why here? The marshal asked, his voice low. This town's got little more than dust. The cowboy didn't answer. Right away. When he did, his words felt like stones dropped into water. Because of her. He glanced toward the widow, and though his eyes did not linger long, the meaning in them stirred every shadow around her. Her breath caught. Around her, men shifted uncomfortably, glancing her way but not daring to speak. She wanted to demand. What he meant, to deny it, but the words froze on her tongue. Some part of her knew he wasn't wrong. For years she had carried the burden of whispers, the widow with land no man had claimed, the woman who held deeds and secrets passed down by her late husband. She had always suspected that what she owned was worth more than the quiet life she lived. And now the truth was riding straight toward her. Later, when the men scattered to their posts, the widow caught the cowboy alone near the livery. The buffet. Horses shifted nervously, sensing the unease of their masters. She stood in the doorway, the lantern light brushing her face. What did you mean saying this is about me? She asked, her voice firm though her hands trembled. He tightened the strap on his saddle before answering. Your land runs to the river. Water's scarce out here. Cain's been pushing south, taking what keeps men alive. If he owns the water, he owns every herd and every man who drinks. He looked at her then, eyes steady. You're the last piece standing in his way. The widow's knees weakened, though she refused to show it. And you think he'll burn the whole town just to take what's mine? He don't just want it. He wants to make sure no one ever forgets it's his. That's who Cain is. She turned away, her breath shaking. For years, she had fought to keep her land, paying taxes, fending off offers, enduring the gossip of being a woman holding more than some men could stomach. But she had never imagined it would bring ruin down on the heads of her neighbors. The cowboy's voice softened. This ain't your fault. Cain's a vulture. He'd have found another reason if not this one. Still, the widow felt the weight, pressing on her chest. The town would bleed for what she held, and the thought hollowed her. The hours crawled on. A nervous calm settled, broken only by the clatter of boots and the scrape of barrels being moved into place. The widow moved among the women, helping where she could, her hands steady though her heart churned. She caught bits of talk men swearing. They'd never lived to see sunrise. Mothers praying their children wouldn't wake to hear the shots. And always the cowboy was there, moving through the town like a shadow, giving strength where the marshal faltered, steadying nerves with a word or a look. Some men bristled at his authority, but none could deny the fire he carried out as dawn crept closer, the hoofbeats came again. This time there was no mistaking them. A rolling thunder across the plains, closer and closer, until the ground itself seemed to quiver beneath their weight. Lanterns were doused, rifles raised, and the town held its breath. From her place behind the barricade of barrels outside the mercantile, the widow could see the horizon glowing faint with the first light of day. Against it, shadows emerged riders, dozens of them, black shapes moving fast. At their front, tall and broad in the saddle, rode a man whose presence seemed to darken the very sky around him. Cain. The widow felt her blood run cold. The cowboy stood a few paces ahead, shoulders squared, his figure rigid as the riders drew near. And though every instinct in her screamed to hide, to pray, to run, she could not take her eyes from him. Because in that moment, with the enemy bearing down and the town trembling on the edge of ruin, she realized the night was only the beginning and the true storm was about to break. The first rays of dawn crept slow over the hills, painting the sky in pale streaks of gray and gold. The light did nothing to soften what was coming. Dust rose on the horizon like smoke, a heavy cloud carried by the pounding of hooves. The outlaws moved as one dark wave, the glint of rifles catching the weak sun, the sound of their approach swelling until it seemed to rattle every nail in Dry Creek. Mothers pulled children inside. Men gripped their rifles tighter, and the air itself thickened as though the whole town held its breath. The widow stood behind the barricade outside the mercantile, her hands folded against the wood though her knuckles had turned white. Every nerve in her body screamed for her to run, yet her legs refused. She could not tear her eyes away from the riders closing in. At the front of the pack rode Cain. He was a giant in the saddle, broad-shouldered, his coat flaring behind him, his face set with a confidence that chilled her. He didn't ride like a man rushing to a fight. He rode like a man already certain he'd won. Beside her, the cowboy stood with a rifle in hand, hat pulled low, shoulders squared against the rising sun. He hadn't spoken since the first hoofbeats were heard. His silence was a strange kind of comfort, as if words no longer mattered, only what was about to be done. The widow felt the weight of him near her, and though fear coursed through her veins, it steadied her somehow. The marshal paced a few steps away, his badge catching the light, though his face looked older than ever. "Hold your fire," he barked, his voice cracking. "Let 'em come close. Don't waste shots." The men nodded, but their eyes were restless, flicking from Cain's riders to the cowboy, as though deciding who truly held command now. Riders slowed as they reached the edge of town, spreading out in a wide half-circle, horses stamping and snorting clouds of steam into the cold morning air. The silence that followed was deafening. Only the creak of saddles and the wind whispering down the street broke it. Cain raised one hand and the outlaws stilled. His gaze swept over the town, pausing on every shuttered window, every trembling barrel of rifles. Then his eyes found the widow. He smiled. It was not the smile of a man greeting neighbors, but the kind that cut to the bone a promise of what he had come to take. Dry Creek. Cain called, his voice booming like thunder rolling off the hills. "You've had a quiet life out here." "Too quiet. That ends today." The widow's heart lurched as the man's words filled the street. She glanced at the cowboy, but his expression remained hard, unreadable. Cain's gaze lingered on her again, and his smile widened. "I come for what's mine. You know it, widow. That land you sit on, it ain't yours to keep. The river belongs to men strong enough to hold it, and I don't see any such men here." A ripple of anger surged through the crowd behind the barricades. The blacksmith cursed under his breath, tightening his grip on the hammer he refused to trade for a gun. The preacher muttered prayers louder, as if drowning out Cain's voice might shield the people from its weight. The marshal stepped forward, his hand trembling near the holster at his hip. "This is a law-abiding town," he called, though the strength in his tone faltered. "We won't hand over what don't belong to you. You ride out of here now, Cain, or you'll face us all." Cain laughed, a deep rolling sound that carried across the street. He leaned in his saddle, shaking his head. "Face you all? I burned the Miller place to the ground last night. You think I won't do the same here? You've got women and children behind those doors, Marshal. You want their blood on your hands?" The marshal stiffened, but before he could answer, the cowboy stepped forward. He moved with a kind of calm that made every eye turn. His rifle stayed lowered, but his voice carried, steady and sure. "You talk too much, Cain." The outlaws shifted, some reaching for their guns, but Cain lifted a hand to hold them back. His eyes narrowed as he looked at the cowboy. Recognition flickered there, and the widow saw it, the shadow of some history between them. "Well," Cain drawled, leaning forward in his saddle, "ain't this something? I thought I left you in the dirt 2 years ago." The widow felt her breath catch. She turned sharply to the cowboy, but his face gave nothing away. Only his hand tightened slightly on the rifle. "You missed," the cowboy said. Kane's smile vanished, replaced by a sneer. He straightened in his saddle, his voice sharp. "Then I'll fix that mistake today." The tension snapped tight, like a rope pulled to breaking. Every man behind the barricade lifted his rifle. Every outlaw's hand twitched toward their holsters. The widow's pulse pounded in her ears as she felt the street balance on the edge of fire. But Kane wasn't finished. He raised his voice once more, calling to the townsfolk. "You don't have to die for her. Hand over the widow and the land she clings to, and I'll let the rest of you live. Think on it, one woman, for the lives of all your kin. Seems a fair trade." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The widow's stomach turned to ice as dozens of eyes shifted her way. She saw it in their faces, the fear, the temptation. Some looked at her with pity, others with calculation. She knew what they were thinking. If sacrificing her meant saving their children, was it not the wiser choice? Her breath shook, but she straightened her back, refusing to bow. Yet the weight of their stares pressed hard, and for the first time since her husband's death, she felt truly alone. The cowboy stepped forward another pace, his voice sharp as steel. "Ain't a man or woman here Kane can break, not tonight." Kane laughed again, but there was no humor in it now. He dropped his hand, and the sound of rifles cocking filled the morning air. Horses pawed the dirt, outlaws leaning forward like wolves scenting blood. The marshal shouted, "Hold steady." But his voice was lost beneath the storm that was about to break. The widow's chest tightened, her breath shallow. She gripped the wood of the barricade, her nails digging deep, as the moment stretched thin as glass. The first shot had not yet been fired, but she could feel it coming sharp, sudden, and unstoppable. Her eyes found the cowboy again. He stood tall, hat brim shadowing his eyes, rifle raised now ready. And in that instant, she realized he wasn't just fighting for the town. He was fighting for her. For everything she carried, for every reason Kane had come to take it away. The outlaw leader shifted in his saddle, his hand dropping toward the revolver at his side. The riders behind him tensed, eager, waiting. And then, in the fragile silence of dawn, the world held still for the briefest breath before the first crack of a gunshot split the air and hurled Dry Creek into the fire it had feared all night long. The gunshot tore through the dawn, sharp as a whip crack. Horses screamed and men shouted, and in an instant the street of Dry Creek became fire and thunder. Bullets ripped into the barricades, wood splintering around the townsfolk crouched low behind them. Smoke filled the air, choking and bitter, as rifles answered back from windows and doorways. The widow pressed herself against the barrels, heart hammering, ears ringing with every report. She could barely see through the haze, but she caught sight of the cowboy striding into the open street, rifle raised steady against his shoulder. His movements were calm, measured, as though the chaos around him could not touch him. Every shot he fired struck true, knocking riders from their saddles, slowing the wave of outlaws that pressed toward the town. Kane bellowed commands above the roar, urging his men forward. His voice carried through the smoke, cruel and relentless. The outlaw leader cut a dark figure, revolvers blazing as he pushed into the fray. No bullets seemed to touch him, no fear slowed his charge. He wanted the town broken, wanted the widow's land claimed before the sun stood high. The townsfolk fought with everything they had. The blacksmith swung his hammer when his rifle jammed, striking a rider clean out of the saddle. The preacher, Bible tucked under one arm, passed cartridges to trembling boys barely old enough to hold their rifles. Mothers clutched children in cellars, whispering prayers through the rattle of gunfire. And the marshal, old though he was, stood tall in the center of the street, firing until the chambers of his revolver clicked empty. The widow's fear hardened into resolve. She grabbed a fallen rifle from beside her, hands shaking as she loaded it. Her late husband had taught her to shoot once, long ago, though she had never thought to use it again. Now she steadied the barrel against the barricade, sighted through the smoke, and fired. The kick slammed her shoulder, but she saw the outlaw she aimed at fall back off his horse. The fight raged on, hour stretching into hour, the sun climbing higher over the bloodied street. Dust and smoke turned the air into a suffocating fog. Yet still the cowboy stood, tireless, his figure a constant presence at the heart of the defense. Every time the widow's courage faltered, her eyes found him, and strength returned to her dot at last. When the ground was littered with bodies and the outlaw's numbers had thinned, Cain pushed forward alone. His horse, black as night, reared as he charged down the center of the street. The cowboy stepped to meet him, revolver drawn now, his hat brim lifted just enough for the widow to see the fire in his eyes. The two men faced each other in the open, the town frozen around them. It was not just a fight for land or water anymore. It was the settling of something old, a history written in scars and silence. Cain sneered, his revolver spinning in his hand with practiced ease. "I should have finished you last time," he growled. "You ain't got the aim," the cowboy answered, his voice steady. The widow's breath caught as the world seemed to pause once more. Then both men drew. The crack of their shots echoed down the street. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Cain swayed in his saddle, eyes wide with shock. Blood bloomed dark across his chest, and he toppled from his horse, crashing into the dust. His revolver slipped from his hand, landing silent beside him. Cowboy lowered his gun slowly, his chest heaving with breath he had not allowed himself to take. Around him, the outlaws faltered. Leaderless, wounded, and beaten, they scattered in panic, some spurring their horses hard for the horizon, others throwing down their weapons and begging for mercy. Dry Creek's people shouted after them, but the cowboy raised a hand. "Let 'em run," he said, voice hoarse. "They've lost what they came for." Silence fell heavy over the town, broken only by the cries of the wounded and the groan of horses. The widow rose slowly from behind her barricade, rifle still clutched in her hands. Her legs trembled as she stepped out into the street, past the fallen, past the blood soaking into the dust. She came to stand before the cowboy, who wiped sweat and smoke from his brow with the back of his hand. Their eyes met, and for a long moment neither spoke. The battle was over, but the weight of it hung between them. The widow saw the weariness in him, the scars of old fights and the fresh pain of this one. He had stood for a town that wasn't his, for people who doubted him, and for her, most of all for her. The marshal staggered forward, his badge glinting weak in the morning sun. "It's done," he rasped, though his eyes shone wet with relief. He looked at the cowboy, then at the widow, and lowered his head in respect. The blacksmith clapped soot-stained hands together, though his voice cracked. "We held them, by God, we held them." But the widow could not feel victory, not with so many gone, not with the bodies lying still in the street. She turned her eyes toward the edge of town, where the Miller family's fate had already been sealed the night before. The cost of survival was etched into the silence that followed. The cowboy seemed to sense her thoughts. He stepped closer, his voice low so only she could hear. "You kept this town alive. Don't forget that." Her throat tightened, but she forced herself to answer. "No, you did." He shook his head, a faint shadow of a smile touching his lips. "Took all of us." As the townsfolk gathered their dead and tended their wounded, the widow stood by the cowboy's side, her hands clasped tight against her chest. She knew Cain's threat would not return his reign of terror, ended in the dust of Dry Creek. But she also knew the scars of this day would linger long in the hearts of every man, woman, and child who had survived Dot in the days that followed. The town rebuilt what had been broken. Windows shattered were patched, doors torn down were replaced, and the sound of hammering echoed from sunup to sundown. The preacher buried the dead with solemn words, and the blacksmith forged iron crosses to stand over their graves. The widow opened her home to children left without parents, her rooms filled with the sound of voices she had not heard in years. The marshal, humbled, carried on his duty with a new weight on his shoulders. No longer did he stand alone. The town had seen what it meant to fight as one, and the old lawman leaned on that strength. As for the cowboy, he lingered at the edge of town, fixing saddles, helping where he could, but never staying too long in one place. His restlessness was plain, a man bound to the trail even when others wished him still. Yet the widow felt his presence everywhere. She carried the sound of his voice, the steadiness of his hand, the memory of his stand in the heart of the storm. Evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of fire, she found him by the livery, tightening the reins of his horse. Her heart ached at the sight, knowing what it meant. "You're leaving," she said softly. He nodded, eyes on the horizon. "Town's safe now. My work's done." She stepped closer, her voice trembling. "You could stay. Dry Creek could use a man like you." His gaze lifted to hers, and for a moment she thought he might say yes. But instead, he gave her that same faint smile, the one that carried sorrow beneath it. "The trail don't let go easy." Tears stung her eyes, though she would not let them fall. "Then promise me one thing. Don't forget this place." His hand brushed the brim of his hat, tipping it in her direction. "I couldn't if I tried." With that, he swung into the saddle, the horse shifting beneath him, eager for the open land. The widow watched as he rode slowly down the main street, past the mended doors and the graves marked fresh with iron crosses. The townsfolk stopped in their work to watch him go, each one knowing they owed him more than words could hold. At the edge of town, the cowboy turned once, lifting a hand in farewell. Then he rode into the fading light, his figure swallowed by the horizon, leaving behind only the memory of his stand and the whisper of hope he had given them all. The widow stood. Long after he was gone, the quiet of Dry Creek settling around her. She thought of the battle, of the fear, of the lives lost and saved. And she thought of him, the drifter who had walked into her life with a whisper and left it with a promise. Though the town would rebuild and the land would endure, she knew the story of that night would live on. A story of courage, of unity, of sacrifice. A story of how one town faced the fire and rose again, and as the stars blinked awake above the prairie, the widow whispered into the night, her voice steady at last. "We'll remember. Dry Creek was scarred, but it was alive. The land was still theirs. The river still ran. And though the cowboy was gone, his shadow lingered in every heartbeat of the town he had saved. Top of form, bottom of form.